They slammed him against the hood as if he were trash, not a man who had written national security policy read by presidents. The irony was too sharp to swallow. He had drafted federal guidelines on de-escalation, and here he was, bleeding under the hands of men who had never read a single page. Professor David Cole never raised his voice. He didn't need to. His silence burned louder than their shouts. And yet, in that silence, his mind replayed a lifetime of indignities, every boy, every suspicious glance in a store, every hand tightened on a purse as he walked past. This was not new. This was America unmasked. The police cruiser's lights flashed crimson and blue, but in David's mind, it was history flashing back at him. The shackles of slavery, the dogs of Birmingham, the baton strikes in Selma. The difference was only the date. He was walking home from a lecture at Georgetown, his briefcase still holding a speech draft on counterterrorism strategies, when the squad car screeched beside him. The accusation was as vague as it was venomous. "You fit the description," he asked, calmly. "Description of what?" That was enough to be thrown against the car, enough for their fists to declare war on his body. He tasted copper in his mouth and felt the weight of knees pressing him into cold steel. What they didn't know and what would change everything within minutes was that David was not just a professor. He was one of the president's closest security advisors, a man trusted to shape the nation's defense. As they spat orders and threats, he thought of his daughter, Maya, 13 years old, who once asked him why police never smiled at them like they smiled at her white classmates' parents. What answer could he give her now, with asphalt scraping his cheek? His mind clung to dignity, refusing to let rage define him, though rage pulsed in every vein. The younger officer, trembling with adrenaline, called him boy again, and something ancient stirred inside David. He wanted to shout back, to rip the uniform from this man and force him to see the truth. But restraint was survival. He had learned that lesson long ago. A crowd began to gather. Phones were raised. The whispers spread like sparks. "Isn't that Professor Cole? Doesn't he work with the White House?" The officers didn't notice, too lost in their own theater of dominance. Their voices cracked with the intoxication of unchecked power. David's vision blurred, but through it, he saw the golden edge of the setting sun slicing across the street, turning the scene into something larger than life, as if history itself had arrived to bear witness. And then the voice came urgent, authoritative, impossible to ignore. "Stop immediately." A Secret Service agent, one of David's own colleagues, had been nearby, alerted by a bystander who recognized the professor. In an instant, the narrative shifted. The officers froze, confusion flickering across their faces. The word advisor was spoken aloud, and suddenly the men who had treated him like dirt were confronted with the unbearable weight of their mistake. David lay there, breath ragged, wondering if this revelation would matter or if America's sickness ran too deep for even the truth to heal. His mind drifted back through decades, to his first day as a professor when a student challenged his authority simply because of his skin, to the countless meetings where his expertise was second-guessed until repeated by a white colleague. This moment was not a rupture, but a continuation, a grotesque confirmation of what he always knew. Titles and honors did not shield him from the gaze of racism. The Secret Service agent demanded their names, their badges. The officers stammered. One muttered something about a mistake. But David knew better. It was never just a mistake. It was a choice, a prejudice dressed as protocol. Slowly, he pushed himself upright, blood still on his lip, his voice trembling but clear. "You did not see a man. You saw a color. And because of that, you nearly destroyed everything I am." The silence that followed was heavier than any siren. For the first time, the officers seemed to grasp not the full history, not the centuries of oppression, but at least the immediate consequences of their arrogance. Cameras recorded everything. The nation would soon watch. Yet even in that moment of vindication, David felt no triumph. Only exhaustion. Only the deep, hollow ache of a man forced to prove his humanity again and again. As paramedics approached, David lifted his eyes toward the golden sky. The sun had dipped lower, painting the city in amber light, as if reminding him that darkness was never permanent. But he also knew light did not arrive on its own. It was fought for, carried, demanded. His daughter's face returned to his mind. For her, he would continue to fight. For her, He would transform this moment of humiliation into testimony. And so, though pain throbbed in his ribs and shame clung to his spirit, David Cole stood tall. Because that was what survival required. And survival, in America, was still an act of resistance. The crowd did not disperse. They lingered, whispering, their phones still raised high like weapons of truth. The murmurs carried over the hum of traffic. They attacked him. He works for the president. They didn't even ask questions. Each fragment of gossip was a seed of outrage, and David knew those seeds would grow, watered by the footage that was already uploading to countless feeds. Somewhere, right now, people were pressing play, watching him struggle against a car hood, hearing the officers spit venomous words. His humiliation had gone public in real time. He hated that, but he also knew it was necessary. Stories without proof were dismissed. But now the world had proof. The senior officer, a broad man with tired eyes and a clenched jaw, finally seemed to realize the storm he had walked into. His hand hovered near his belt as if he might draw his weapon, not out of need but instinct, the reflex of a man trained to assert dominance. Yet he hesitated. The uniform no longer carried the same weight. Authority had slipped from his grasp, and for the first time that night, David saw something in him other than aggression. He saw fear. "Professor Cole," the Secret Service agent said firmly, stepping between David and the officers. "You're safe now. We'll take it from here." The agent's presence was a wall of protection, his badge glinting under the fading sun. The officers shifted uneasily. They had been predators moments ago, but now they looked like cornered prey, awaiting judgment. David coughed, his ribs aching with each breath. He wanted to collapse, to let the paramedics take him away. But his pride was stronger than his pain. He straightened his jacket, wiped blood from his lip, and fixed the officers with a gaze that burned hotter than any spotlight. "You thought you could break me," he said softly, almost too soft to hear. "But all you've broken tonight is the illusion that your power was absolute." The younger officer, the one who had called him boy, opened his mouth as if to apologize, but no words came. His face flushed red, and he looked down at his boots, ashamed or perhaps only embarrassed to be caught. David wondered if shame could survive past this night, or if it would dissolve into excuses by morning. He had seen it before, officers claiming confusion, stress, or mistaken identity. America was a factory of excuses, but excuses did not heal bruises. Excuses did not erase terror. The paramedics urged David onto a stretcher. His body resisted, his pride screaming to walk on his own, but his chest pain made the decision for him. As they strapped him in, he caught the eye of a young woman in the crowd, her phone still raised. Tears streaked her cheeks. She whispered, "Thank you." He wanted to ask her what she meant. Thank you for surviving? Thank you for not fighting back? Or thank you for proving, yet again, that this country had not changed as much as it claimed? But he had no strength to speak. He simply nodded, letting her see that her presence mattered. As the ambulance doors closed, David's thoughts swirled. He thought of the meeting scheduled for the next morning at the White House, where he was supposed to present a strategy on cyber defense. Would he walk into that room battered and bruised, a living contradiction of the system he served? Or would he call in sick, hide his wounds, and let the story fade into the endless noise of outrage? He did not know, but he felt the weight of responsibility pressing heavier than ever. His pain was not just his own. It belonged to every man who had ever been stopped for fitting the description, every woman who had been doubted, every child who had been taught to keep their hands visible and voice quiet when police approached. He was a vessel of their pain, and that meant he could not remain silent. Hours later, in the sterile quiet of a hospital room, David lay awake. The machines beeped steadily, his body aching, but his mind sharper than it had ever been. His phone buzzed relentlessly on the table beside him. Colleagues, reporters, strangers all demanding his voice, his statement. He ignored them all, until a message arrived from the president himself. "I heard what happened. Rest. Tomorrow we talk." Short, simple, but loaded with meaning. David closed his eyes. He knew tomorrow would be another battlefield. The night stretched long, haunted by memories. He remembered his father, who had once been beaten by police in their small southern town for daring to argue over a speeding ticket. He remembered his mother, who cried silently at the kitchen table that night, whispering prayers for her husband's safety. He remembered promising her that one day things would be different. And yet here he was, decades later, reliving his father's pain with different uniforms, different faces, but the same disease. Racism did not die, it mutated. When dawn finally broke, the golden light streaming through the hospital window, David felt a strange calm. The storm had passed inside him. What remained was clarity. He would not let this moment be reduced to another headline that burned brightly for a week and then faded. He would turn it into something lasting, something undeniable. By mid-morning, his hospital room became a command center. Aides from the White House arrived, along with lawyers, civil rights leaders, and media representatives. His daughter Maya burst into the room, tears spilling as she clung to him. "Daddy, I saw the video. I was so scared." He held her close, wincing from the pain but unwilling to let go. "I'm okay, baby. I'm here." She pulled back, her young face hardened by anger far beyond her years. Why do they hate us so much? The question pierced deeper than any bruise. He had no easy answer, only truth. Because fear blinds people, but we will not let their fear define us. Later that day, standing at a podium in the White House press room, David Cole faced the nation. Cameras clicked. The world watched. He wore his injuries openly, the bruise on his cheek a badge of truth. His voice did not tremble. "Last night," he began, "I was not a professor. I was not an advisor. I was not even a citizen in the eyes of those officers. I was only a color. And because of that, I was beaten. This is not just my story. This is America's story. And it is a story we must finally, fully confront." The room fell silent. Reporters leaned forward, their pens paused. David continued, "I do not seek vengeance. I seek accountability. I do not seek pity. I seek justice. And justice begins when we stop pretending that what happened to me is rare. It is not rare. It is the daily reality of millions." He paused, letting the words sink in. The silence was heavy, but it was not empty. It was alive with recognition, with guilt, with the stirring of conscience. As he stepped away from the podium, he felt lighter. Not healed. Healing would take time but purposeful. He had turned pain into testimony, humiliation into power. Now the real battle would begin, pushing for reforms, demanding accountability, refusing to let the system sweep his story under the rug. He knew the road would be long. He knew backlash would come. But he also knew this. The sun always rose, golden and unyielding, no matter how dark the night. And so would he. That evening, back at home, David sat with Maya on the porch. The air was cool, the sky painted in amber hues. She leaned against him, her small hand gripping his larger one. "Did you win today?" she asked quietly. He smiled faintly, eyes on the horizon. "No, baby. Today wasn't about winning. It was about making sure the fight is seen. And tomorrow, we keep going." She nodded, thoughtful beyond her years. The golden light wrapped around them, soft and forgiving. For the first time in a long time, David allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, a future could be brighter. The porch light buzzed faintly above them, insects circling in the glow, but David's mind was not on the night air. His body ached, his ribs bruised, but the pain only sharpened his determination. He could still hear the chant of voices outside the White House press room earlier that day. Protesters had gathered spontaneously, holding signs, shouting his name, demanding justice. The video of his assault had gone viral overnight, and America was divided in its reaction: outrage on one side, denial on the other. He had expected nothing less. Maya leaned her head against his arm, her voice barely above a whisper. "Are they going to fire those police?" David exhaled slowly, searching for words that would not break her fragile hope. Maybe, maybe not. The system moves slowly, and sometimes it doesn't move at all. But what we can do is keep shining a light until it has no choice but to change. She frowned, her young brow furrowed. "That's not fair." He kissed the top of her head. "You're right. It's not. But fairness has never been handed to us. It's something we build, piece by piece." Inside the house, the television hummed with news coverage. Analysts dissected his speech, politicians positioned themselves on either side, and pundits debated whether his words would spark reform or fade into the endless cycle of outrage. David muted the TV. He could not bear the chatter of people turning his pain into a spectacle. He preferred the silence, the simple sound of crickets in the yard and his daughter's steady breathing beside him. The next morning, David returned to work despite his injuries. His colleagues greeted him with solemn respect. Some avoided his eyes, ashamed of their own silence in past conversations. Others clasped his shoulder, offering support without words. In the Oval Office, the president listened intently as David recounted every detail of the assault. The room was heavy with tension. "This cannot stand," the president said firmly. "We need to act." David nodded, though he knew the machinery of government was slow. He also knew that symbolism mattered as much as policy. His story had become a symbol, and symbols could move people faster than legislation ever could. Still, he pushed for concrete action: mandatory body cameras, independent review boards, funding for community policing. The president agreed to form a task force, placing David at its head. It was a small step, but a step nonetheless. That afternoon, David walked across the south lawn, the golden sun warming his bruised face. Reporters shouted questions, cameras clicked, but he kept moving. He was not a spectacle. He was a man with work to do. Yet inside, he wrestled with doubt. Could one man's story truly change a system built on centuries of prejudice? Or would it simply fade, like so many before it? He did not know, but he knew he had to try. As the days passed, the country roiled with reaction. Protests spread from Washington to New York, Chicago, Los Angeles. People of all colors carried signs bearing David's name, chanting for justice. In some cities, clashes erupted between demonstrators and police. Politicians argued on cable news, their voices rising with indignation or denial. Some officers resigned in protest of the scrutiny, while others quietly admitted the need for reform. The nation was cracking open, its wounds exposed, and David stood at the center of it all. One night, as he prepared for bed, his phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. "You should have kept quiet. Next time, you won't be so lucky." He stared at the words, his stomach tightening. Threats were not new to him. His work in national security had always carried risks. But this was different. This was personal. He locked the phone and set it aside, refusing to let fear dictate his actions. Yet when he checked on Maya, sleeping peacefully in her room, he felt a wave of dread. The fight for justice was not only his to bear, it endangered those he loved most. The following morning, he addressed his team. "We cannot let threats silence us. That is exactly what they want. We must press forward." His voice was steady, though inside he trembled. He knew courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. Weeks turned into months. The task force gathered data, held hearings, interviewed victims and officers alike. David traveled the country, meeting with families who had lost loved ones to police violence. Their stories broke him and rebuilt him in equal measure. A mother in Minneapolis clutched his hand, tears streaming as she described her son shot during a traffic stop. A father in Texas showed him the faded baseball cap his boy had worn the day he was arrested and beaten. Each story was a mirror, reflecting his own night of terror, and each strengthened his resolve. Meanwhile, the officers who had assaulted him faced investigation. The department tried to paint it as an unfortunate misunderstanding, but the video told another story. Public pressure mounted, and eventually, charges were filed. The courtroom was packed the day the trial began. David testified, his voice calm but unyielding. He described every detail: the words, the fists, the fear. The defense tried to discredit him, suggesting he had resisted, but the footage contradicted them at every turn. The jury watched in silence as the video played again and again. When the verdict was announced guilty on multiple counts, the courtroom erupted. Some wept, some cheered, some simply sat in stunned silence. David closed his eyes, feeling no triumph, only relief. Justice had been served, at least in this one case. But he knew the work was far from over. A single verdict did not dismantle a system. It was only a spark. That evening, as he walked out of the courthouse, the golden sunset bathed the steps in light. Reporters rushed toward him, microphones extended, but he raised his hand. "Tonight is not about me," he said. "It is about every person who has suffered in silence. Let this verdict be the beginning, not the end." His words echoed across the plaza, carried by the wind, etched into memory. Later, at home, Maya hugged him tightly. "You did it, Daddy," she whispered. He smiled faintly. "We did it. All of us." They sat together on the porch once more, the night air cool and calm. Above them, the stars stretched across the sky, silent witnesses to the struggle below. For the first time in months, David felt a glimmer of peace. The road ahead was long, but he was no longer walking it alone. He thought of the golden light that had followed him through this journey, the sunlight slicing across the street the night of his assault, the amber hues of the press room, the warm glow on the courthouse steps. It was as if the universe itself insisted on reminding him that light was always there, even in the darkest moments. And perhaps that was the lesson he was meant to carry, that resilience was not just survival, but the insistence on seeking light, on becoming light, even when surrounded by shadows. David closed his eyes, the hum of crickets lulling him. Tomorrow, the fight would continue. But tonight, under the golden sky, he allowed himself to breathe, to hope, to believe that justice, though slow, was still possible. Weeks turned into seasons, and though the bruises on David's body faded, the mark of that night never left him. His name had become a rallying cry, yet he remained cautious of being turned into a symbol without substance. To him, the work was never about fame or martyrdom. It was about the quiet, steady grind of change. Still, he could not ignore the shift that had occurred across the nation. Universities invited him to speak not only about national security, but about justice. Churches, community centers, and even high schools wanted his story told. At first, he resisted. He did not want his pain to be consumed like entertainment. But then he remembered the young woman in the crowd the night of his assault. Her whispered, "Thank you." Maybe stories were not chains. Maybe they were torches. And so he spoke. He told audiences not just about that night, but about the long history that led to it. He told them about his father's scars, his mother's prayers, his daughter's questions. He spoke of how racism was not simply the act of a few bad officers, but the design of a system that had been centuries in the making. His words traveled further than he ever expected, carried by recordings, shared across platforms, discussed in classrooms. Some resisted, some attacked, but many listened. And listening, he knew, was the first crack in silence. Meanwhile, the task force he led delivered its recommendations. Independent oversight boards were established in several states. New de-escalation training programs began. Federal funding was redirected toward community initiatives. The changes were small compared to the vastness of the problem, but they were real. And real, David believed, was better than perfect. Still, backlash was fierce. Police unions denounced him as anti-law enforcement. Politicians accused him of dividing the nation. Anonymous threats appeared in his inbox weekly. Once, his car tires were slashed outside his home. Fear pressed against him like a constant shadow, but he refused to let it consume him. For every threat, he remembered the families he had met, the tears shed in his arms, the stories entrusted to him. Their courage demanded his own. One crisp autumn evening, as golden leaves scattered across the lawn, David sat once more with Maya on the porch. She had grown taller, her voice steadier, her questions sharper. "Daddy," she asked, "do you think things will ever really change? Or are we just fighting forever?" David looked at her, the porch light reflecting in her eyes. He thought of all the times he had asked himself that same question. Slowly, he answered, "Change doesn't come like a thunderstorm, baby. It comes like sunrise. Slow, steady, but inevitable. Our job is to keep walking toward the light, even when the night feels endless." She nodded, though doubt still lingered on her face. He understood. Doubt was part of hope. They were two sides of the same coin. That winter, David returned to the university classroom. His students greeted him with thunderous applause, but he quickly silenced it. "Don't clap for me," he told them. "Clap for yourselves, if you are willing to carry this fight forward. Because this cannot end with me." He challenged his students to question systems, to confront prejudice, to dream of a country where skin color did not determine survival. Some resisted, some leaned in, but all were forced to see what they could no longer ignore. The years passed. David's influence grew, though he never sought it. He published books, gave speeches at international forums, and continued advising the White House. His work was honored with awards, yet the memory of that night remained sharper than any accolade. In interviews, he often said, "I would trade every award for a world where my daughter never has to fear the police." Maya grew into a young woman, bold and brilliant. She studied law, determined to fight injustice from the courtroom. On the day she passed the bar exam, she handed her father a note that read, "This is for you. for Grandpa, for everyone who never got justice. He wept when he read it, not from sadness, but from the profound weight of legacy. One summer evening, years after the assault, David stood again in front of a crowd, this time at the Lincoln Memorial. Tens of thousands filled the space, their faces glowing in the golden light of dusk. He looked out over the sea of humanity and felt the echoes of history to march on Washington, the voices of those who had come before him. His voice carried across the crowd. Justice is not a destination. It is a journey we walk together. My story is one of pain, yes, but also of resilience. And resilience is not just survival, it is transformation. Tonight, let us transform our pain into purpose, our fear into courage, our silence into song. The crowd erupted, not with anger, but with hope. Candles were lit, their flames flickering against the twilight. As he stood there, bathed in golden light, David felt the presence of his ancestors, of every soul who had fought for freedom, whispering that the struggle was not in vain. Later that night, back at home, David sat once more on his porch, now older, his hair flecked with gray, his body slower, but his spirit undimmed. Maya sat beside him, her law books spread across the table, her determination fierce. They watched the stars in silence, the air filled with the hum of summer. Finally, David spoke. "You asked me once if things would ever really change. Do you still wonder?" Maya smiled faintly. "I think I see the sunrise, Daddy. Not the whole sun, not yet, but the light is there." David closed his eyes, letting the golden warmth of memory and hope wash over him. For the first time since that night, he felt peace not because the world was healed, but because he knew the fight would outlive him, carried forward by those he loved, by those who believed. And in that quiet moment, beneath the endless sky, he understood survival was resistance, but hope was victory. The golden light lingered on the horizon, promising that the story of justice was still being written and that one day it would be complete. Thank you for listening. If you find it interesting, please like and subscribe to follow the next stories.